Give us like 6 months notice, and because we're very ambitious, we said for sure. And then we also said, now that we have this concept, what's really going on here? And we realized that there's this beautiful contrast between how humans move, how robots move, but specifically around labor and work. And so we said, we're gonna do this as an endurance performance, and I'll dance with a robot for 8 hours straight. And that will be our commentary and our reimagining of the American workday. How many people in this room have danced with a robot for 8 hours straight? Yeah, and I can tell you that I think we set the Guinness World Record for it. It's under submission, but we're waiting to find out whether it's a yay or a nay. And so now that we had this idea that I'm going to dance with a robot for 8 hours straight, and sure enough, all of our roboticists and everybody was going to sit there and work with the robot for 8 hours straight, we got written up in the New York Times, so they highlighted this for their kind of winter preview. This was last year. And what did we want to do with those 8 hours of potential human and robot motion? We decided to fill it with all of these different kinds of labor and work. So we looked at motions like stirring or changing a light bulb, wiping a mirror, painting a wall, moving a pallet, sweeping a floor. And we saw this exaltation of the beauty of capability, of how broad-ranging the human body can be, how expressive, that we can do so many different kinds of motions. And now can we give a robot the capability of doing these same kinds of motions? Of course, this was very controversial because everyone, when they comes to robots, they always ask, when is the robot coming for my job? So non-roboticists have this major fear about robots taking over and coming for all of our jobs. Of course, this has been shown in many different forms of media. And Ken and I are inviting people to consider the possibility that there's a much broader future with humans and robots. And so then we started looking at the history of labor and how humans move in labor. This was some industrial kind of turn of the century. People were studying how humans labor, these time and motion studies. This is early motion capture. We can see how do they actually move through space to accomplish different kinds of tasks. How can they do that more efficiently? Marcel Duchamp, so different painters who are being able to capture these kinds of time and motion studies, and of course through images as well. So there's always been this deep fascination with how to do work more efficiently. Finally, a couple of definitions here. So we then wanted to construct this 8-hour piece. And so we came up with a motif, which all that is it's a series of motions. And that's either motions that are stirring, or they've been guided through open pose, or we've programmed them directly with sinusoids, or I've moved them around in teach mode. So we would have a block, a series of different motions we could choose from. This 0G teach mode is just when the robot is fully compliant. We can record the motion that the robot's doing or not, so we can simply have it be compliant during that series. And then force mode is when it's partially compliant, and the gripper will react to the forces that you provided the gripper. So then, in order to create a main performance, we then needed to sequence all of these different motifs together. And as a choreographer and as artists, you always want to be moving pieces around. So we needed, Ethan and Shreya wrote this software that was very flexible, so we could slot things and change the order of what we're doing at all times. We had a very simple state machine, which is moving from motif A to motif B. We've got a collision checker that says, does this final joint angle, is it going to wrist collide with the first joint angle of the next section, yes or no? And if we need to, we can interpolate, and if we don't, then we can just keep going and do it and do it. Or if we need to, we can flip the wrist and make sure everything's fine, and if we don't, we'll interpolate and go straight into motif B. So this is kind of what things look like during the show. I did not memorize 8 hours worth of motions, and so we had these slides that were playing alongside, so I was getting cues. I got pretty close to memorizing the whole thing. And this is a sample of what it looked like at National Sawdust last year. This is a motion that has been extracted from open pose, is what the robot is currently doing, and then I'm following alongside. That's one of the motifs. And then this is a very different part of the show, where we were kind of trading motions off back and forth. So I would move, and then the robot would move, and we would inherit motions from each other. And you can see Ken, Ethan, and Shreya off to the right. They had their hands on the e-stop the whole time, making sure that nobody got harmed, because we did all kinds of things with this robot that you're not typically supposed to do. Okay, and now I want to zoom out a little bit, now that we've talked about Breathless, and really speak about our future with choreography and robots. The main difference between a robot and a computer is that a robot moves. Full stop. Choreography is to robotics what user experience is to computers. When you took a computer out of a research lab, out of a military facility, and you stuck it in somebody's house, all of a sudden you needed linguistics, semiotics, psychology. That is where human-computer interaction showed up. It's because all of a sudden now you have billions of people who are using these devices, and not just a rarefied few hundred or thousand. And we're doing the same thing with robotics. We're taking robots out of the factory, out of the military facility, and we're sticking them in people's homes and hospitals. If I'm 75 years old, I have no interest in learning how to teleoperate a robot or program a computer. All I want to do is move and talk. And if I want to do that, I need choreography. And this is where choreographers and roboticists actually have been working on similar problems for a very long time. And so if you want the motion of a robot to express anything, to be meaningful in any way, whether it's concern, care, urgency, love, loathing, etc., you call a choreographer. And interestingly, I just had a conversation with Tom Sheep early at Waymo, where he was like, I've been talking about robot choreography since 2010 because I needed to get a robot to drive in a way that people felt safe. People felt empowered, they felt inspired. And this is truly where choreo robotics, I believe, will be the difference maker between a few million robots that do fine things or a billion robots that people actually care about and want to be around. And this is the game changer. This is the table stakes for the next several decades. We all want robots out in the environment in the world. This will be part of what contributes to making that reality possible. So choreographers have to describe and translate motion through scores, teaching, and recording, right? They have all these different ways of being able to describe motion. Roboticists do the exact same thing. They just do it through software and equations. Same problem, two different approaches. Roboticists and choreographers also need to allow room for uncertainty. Right now we have these black boxes of kind of end-to-end learning or state machines. Choreographers deal with the exact same thing, thinking about these things in performance, how you can create actual malleable performance where these different states can transition back and forth. Similarly, choreographers and roboticists rely upon cues and patterns to convey legibility and intent. I would guess that most people in this room have never seen this ballet, but you can gather from the fact that she's red, she's high, and her fingers are outstretched that she's important, and everybody else is in white, right? So nobody needs to have seen this, we just already have a strong belief about what it means. And this is kind of a canonical paper from Anka Dragan in her PhD work where she showed that legible motion is not necessarily the same as predictable or functional. So depending on your goal, you will have very different sets of movements that will get you there. And you need to rely upon these existing cues that people have around legibility and intent, and be aware of them, because if you're not, you're bound to get in trouble. Finally, roboticists and choreographers need methods that generate new motion from scratch. We tend to optimize for things in robotics like time efficiency or energy efficiency. But what if instead we said, let's make as many different motions as we want. Let's make a huge, diverse design space of motions and then pick the ones that we actually desire. Or optimize for something else that isn't just power or speed. This is the same problem that choreographers have. This is why choreographers come up with all crazy different ways of generating motion from scratch. And finally, I think the core of all this is what kinds of experiences can we create that leverage a robot's capabilities as both a utilitarian tool and an evocative social agent, because they are always both. All movement is impactful to humans. We used to get eaten, we used to be chased around by other big mammals, and so there are tons of research studies out there that even if you have random collections of black moving dots or small pieces of shapes moving around the screen, humans tell stories about the movement. They say that they're moving from left to right, that they feel sad, that they remind them of sitting under a tree in the wind, and so you always have some kind of story that you're telling about the motion, and it's our job as roboticists to make sure that the story is the story that we actually want. And I won't have time to talk about this because we're low on time, but I've investigated these things for quite a while. When I was an artist in residence, for example, at places like Everyday Robots, where we were able, we're gonna have to get through these slides really quickly. I don't know how to make it advance. Okay, I'll just keep clicking. I'm gonna keep, these are, okay. Anyway, I've been investigating these things for quite some time because I think they're so truly important to how we're gonna live our lives with robots. If you wanna learn more about this project, that I am not now going to talk about, you can watch my TED Talk from April. And then let me quickly hop through the rest of these. Essentially that we got some really incredible reactions. Oh, and two quick plugs. The brand new Stanford Robotics Center has a dance studio in it. This is how serious the future of choreo robotics is coming to unfold. It is what I think the first ever robotics lab that has a dance studio built inside of the lab with a sprung wood floor and mirrors. And then, of course, there are tons of interesting people who are doing work in this space aside from myself. And one of the things that I am building is a 9-foot-high robotic hand at the Exploratorium. So if you want to learn about more of any of these things, come to our show tonight, 7:30. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. People must have questions.
Okay.
So if we can get some help with the chairs and just reshuffle the stage for the next panel. Then, yeah, who has questions?
So one thing while we're waiting is I hadn't heard you talk about driving as choreography before, but I really like that because if you think about it, it's kind of improv, where when we get out there, you're driving with a lot of other people, there is this idea of like a good driver who is really respectful, leaves space, always aware of what's going on. And I've had an experience recently of being in the back of a Lyft or an Uber, and you see the other kind. And you're really like even this morning I got here, I was like almost car sick from, just the way the person was driving. It's just so ungraceful. So I think it's really interesting, and I think Waymo is a good example. If you guys have had a chance, hopefully most of you have, to take a Waymo, you get a really wonderful experience because it's a very safe and very respectful, I think very graceful kind of choreography that they built into that. Good. Other questions? Oh yes, go ahead.
So I'm really interested in a lot of robotic collaborations in art, and we did a play, Anka and I did a play with her way back in the day, and I think in a lot of the stuff that you're doing, it's kind of like the robot is just performing and humans are responding. It tends to not actually be like a true collaboration, and I think that's in part limitations of the technology that we have right now and the responsiveness. And I'm kind of curious what you think the pathway is there to have like true leader-follower, like collaborative interaction in these types of performances between technology and humans, rather than like technology just kind of like doing a thing and then humans taking up all of the slack of like really interacting with the technology.
The project I worked on at Google, we trained a model on my preferences. So we basically had it flock. We taught robots to flock in all these different patterns and also to respond to different kinds of human gestures and where people were located. And then we trained a model on my preferences with a whole bunch of different kind of hand-tuned features, and we were able to have the robots just improvise and be spontaneous and do unexpected things, and that it could constantly infer based on the pattern it had been in and the next pattern that was going to what it should be doing next to create a compelling performance. And so I would agree with you. I think there's been quite a bit of work in the past that's sort of like the technology in isolation, but I want to push that a little bit, a step further too, which is to say that the technology is in the loop insofar as we did so many different iterations of this project, and it's like exploring how the robot moves relative to how I'm moving, and then we do another iteration based on top of that, and also from what we're inspired by with what the robot brought to the table. And so I think it's maybe what you see in an end product is also a little different than what the process looks like along the way.
I also think it's important to point out that the message here is a kind of reassurance to the public that robots are not as graceful as humans. And I think we have a really long time to go before that gap really is closed. So to your point, I think as researchers, we want to convey that the motions of robots today are still relatively limited. And that's important, and it comes back to the first point I made, which is that I worry about the expectations getting so large that we've seen, and people see science fiction and others, they think, oh, this is all, it's about to happen. But one of the subtexts of our project is to say, wow, there's still a huge gap between the incredible performance of a dancer like Katie and a robot. And that gap, I don't think is going to be closed that easily. Which I think is good news for human beings.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question we have time for.
This is great work, fantastic stuff. When you're dancing on the stage there, I noticed the robot looks like a robot arm. For this sort of early work, that sort of makes sense as that's part of the artistic statement, right? But as those of us who work in robotics know, there's this novelty effect thing, right? So I'm wondering what your vision is for when the novelty effect wears off. Like, what is the future of dancing robots or agents, collaborating with real human artists on stage? And like there's strengths and weaknesses on both sides. Have you thought about that, or some of your visions?
So I think it's important. So I've worked with, 15 different kinds of robots in an artistic context, and I tried once to dress a robot up, and I really didn't like it, because I think that robots need to look like robots. And part of the artistic commentary is to subvert people's expectations about what that machine can do and what environment it can be in. So taking it out of a context where it's picking and placing and making it dance around as a dance partner for 8 hours is part of the artistic statement of what you're bringing to the table. And I also love, I came up with this phrase early on, kind of like constantness. I love that robots have these like high jerk motions, especially industrial ones. I love that they move qualitatively in ways that are different than how humans move. But to your question about the novelty thing, so I think really, and I would love to posit that we've gotten there, right? But I think it's very much about not highlighting, look at this cool robot doing cool robot things, but transcending the tool and saying, look at this body of knowledge or artistic statement or work that could not be created without a robot, because that is part of the message. And it's somehow perennial. It goes beyond the novelty of the tool. I think where we get stuck is if it's all about just pure entertainment and showing off how awesome the tool is. But if it's about a deeper, a broader message, about a sensation that goes beyond just the capabilities of the robot, then I think the novelty factor, I'd worry about at zero.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing.
That's right, and I think it's actually really interesting, and I encourage if you get a chance to see this, because it's very meditative. When the novelty wears off, you're absolutely right. I think that wears off fairly quickly, and then it becomes something about just watching this motion and watching the interplay between the two of them. But it's surprising how long people are interested in sitting down and watching that. So it's going into a different realm than just novelty in some ways. Thanks for that question.
Yeah.
All right, thanks everyone. Appreciate it.
And I just want to say that I'm the Guinness World Records robotics consultant, so I will put in a good word for that longest dancing with a robot record. All right, well, next up, we have a fireside chat about a very important topic that's maybe a little less fun to talk about. And as I think we're all aware on some level, the problem with getting robots out into the world is that people will use them, and sometimes people will use them for what they want to use them for and not what you want to use them for. This is something that we've seen with quadruped robots a lot, just over the last year or so, and it's an inevitability that we will also see it with humanoid robots. So it's certainly something to talk about in advance. So I'll welcome Modar to the stage, along with Andra and Rishi.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking for this before lunch. I'm super excited for this fireside chat. I think we have a video. Let's start with a video.
As an immigrant, I never dreamed that I would be able to run for United States Congress. When I was 22 years old, I anxiously left my parents in India and traveled thousands of miles with a student visa, a few $100s, and a zeal for the American dream. Today, I'm a city council member, an activist, a Valley High-Tech executive, dedicated husband, and loving father. Thank you, America. My name is Rishi Kumar. When my neighborhood experienced a brazen burglary, I organized a neighborhood safety watch program. My passion grew as I led Lego robotics, entrepreneurship boot camps for disadvantaged youths, open mics to help local businesses, and running fundraisers for our senior center. When issues emerged, our community surprisingly reached out to me for solutions. Today we have big challenges. American voices are being drowned out by dark money in politics. Disengaged elected leaders are crippling our system. But I can champion change. We fearlessly challenged unjust rate increases of San Jose Water Company. We dropped burglaries by 41%, more than any Silicon Valley city. I was humbled to be re-elected with the most votes in city history. Not all Democrats are the same, versus me, who has pledged to never accept special interest money, bringing a people-centric agenda, tech expertise, and a getting things done approach. This race is about addressing our challenges with housing, homelessness,
And so on and so on. Thank you so much, Rishi, for joining us. I'm excited to have you together with Andra. Just for background, Rishi and I have known each other for about 10 years or so. You ran for Congress twice. You're quite plugged into the politics ecosystem. We tried to get a good number of politicians on stage. Unfortunately, it was too late. But what I wanted to cover on this panel is things that people just don't like to talk about. I like to call them taboos, and I want to start with the very first one, humanoid weaponization, a very loaded word. I see a good number of politicians now trying to cover this topic. We reached out to Senator Britt, who has written just an op-ed just like 2 months ago. And I think it's super timely. You know, we're talking about the technology aspect of the humanoids and the use cases, the commercialization, the capital allocation. We just don't talk about the other side, because it's a tool, and I do believe that people use tools for good purposes, and there are always bad actors. So why don't we talk about humanoid weaponization, what you think that is. We can cover geopolitics, and then lastly, anything that is considered to be taboo, which is a term that Andra wanted to insert into this panel.
I have a list.
Well, firstly, congratulations to Modar and Andra for putting together a phenomenal event. Can't believe it's the first year. And great turnout. We had some excellent demos, and the robotic world has taken off with a big explosive set of
Not
events.
allowed to use that word and robots. This is the decree from anybody commercializing robots. And this is why, you know, it's really good to talk about taboo topics. Because when you're trying to sell your company's products, there's certain words you just won't go near.
Yeah. And we did try to get Gavin Newsom this year, and it was a little bit last minute, couldn't make it. But next year we'll likely have the governor, but also there's a race for the next governor, which is happening. We have Toni Atkins, who's the president of the state senate. She is in the running. We have Betty E., who I believe is in the Board of Equalization. We have Alini, who's currently the lieutenant governor. Mm-hmm. And then we have Tony, who's the current state superintendent for California. So we hope to get some of these players and have conversations about policies, whether it's for artificial intelligence, but also for robotics, and this movement that is happening today. Now, when we look at the book that you're seeing is Winning the AI Arms Race, and obviously I think the whole robotics industry is embedded as part of that, because when you look at the large language models, they are now morphing into more of the agentic platforms, because to leverage the LLMs, these agents are now being deployed in different verticals. And then as part of that, the robots would have all that sort of data. The AI has to be embedded into these, into the robotic industry based on different verticals. So we see the movement that is happening. And whether we want it or not, you know, AI and robots could be used for sort of evil purposes. And the definition of evil is really what we need to come up with. The bottom line is, it will be used for warfare. And when it comes to, for example, walking up to a nuclear facility, will likely use a robot. And the next superpower could be the one that is actually getting robots to be out there in the battlefields. So yes, that's the future, and we all need to reconcile to that. And in America, when we look at the AI arms race, we have to essentially create pieces of legislations that are pragmatic. And similarly, when you look at China, they've actually jumped ahead with their robotic industry. And the big imperative is for us to ensure we as a nation will make those right choices to apply robot for good purposes, but also to ensure that we are the superpower, we continue to be the superpower.
Now, one of the issues is that these really do need to be nuanced discussions. However, there is an organization, Stop the Killer Robots. Oh. Anyway, that organization has been putting forward a proposal to the United Nations for a number of years now, and it has been passed by all barring 2 of the 3 superpowers. Anybody want to guess which 2 superpowers they are? Yes, Russia is one of them. It's the United States is the other one that won't sign on to the Killer Robots Act. China says we will sign up. Now, how you weight that, it's hard to say. But I'd love to ask Rishi a little bit about balancing the Silicon Valley versus Sacramento tension. Because I would say my biggest failure for Silicon Valley robotics has been failing to engage with politicians. And we're a very small organization, we don't have lobbyists, and Silicon Valley is sometimes a very long way from Sacramento. Even more so, if you remember back 2017, it was the heyday of Chinese VC firms, design studios, manufacturing outlets in Silicon Valley. And that's where you were going if you were a robotics startup. And I had a few discussions with people from the East Coast, particularly involved in federal government, and they're like, no, we wouldn't have Chinese money in robotics. And I'm like, well, actually, that's what's happening. That's who's funding robotics. And shortly thereafter, CFIUS happened. And that was a massive change. So for me, it said, this is the power of what can happen at a federal level, but it also spoke to the distance between the West Coast and the East Coast. Now, who knows what is going to happen next year? But how should we navigate this in the robotics industry? Rishi, do you have any ideas?
So when you look at AI, I keep referencing AI because it's been happening. Senate Bill 1047, I don't know if you guys have heard of Senate Bill 1047. That's Scott Wiener championed in Sacramento. And so we had conversations with Gavin Newsom why that bill was not good. Because if you see the European Union, the industry has left, AI has left, because they have overtly regulated AI. And that's very dangerous, which is exactly what Senate Bill 1047 was doing. And so the imperative is upon us in Silicon Valley. We just had a previous panel discussion. We were talking about regulating bottoms up and not top down. Because if we leave it to the politicians, Washington would like to shut down. There are politicians like Elizabeth Warren who call AI as the big evil, who will also call robotics as the big evil-headed monster, and we have to shut it down. But that's not the reality. If you try to pause AI, the rest of the countries are going to jump forward, and they will actually rule the world. So it's important for us in Silicon Valley to develop a conscience and a playbook of how we need to get it right. And I have a chapter dedicated to that in this particular book. And so these are types of thinking that we need to insert into how we are developing products. We need to engage with Washington, and we need to ensure that the industry is leading the effort and not the politicians.
On a state level, Governor Newsom is doing a good amount of work on AI. California is usually always first at defining certain federal laws or laws that are on a state level, which later on become federal. Tell us a little bit more about what Governor Newsom is working on. I would have loved to ask him. He couldn't be here in person. He's in Sacramento. I think we're going to put this on his calendar for the next event. But nonetheless, what is based on your knowledge and your close connection to Sacramento is being worked on for AI, which you think will make it to the federal stage?
Yes, there are quite a few AI bills that have been proposed, and the way I would summarize this is that Governor Newsom is cautious in his approach, and that's the reason why he vetoed 1047. And so many of these bills that are being proposed by legislators in Sacramento or even in Washington, D.C., they are not being signed by the governor or by the president, because I think we are being cautious and we have to get it right. We cannot regulate just like the EU did, and we shut down the businesses here in Silicon Valley. That will not be productive for us.
Yeah, I would love to see closer connections. As I said, I think this is the biggest weak area of what we've done with Silicon Valley robotics. And I've been saying I would love to reinstitute National Robotics Week, because it was actually managed by iRobot people, and when iRobot was acquired, that disappeared. But I would love to do that much more along the lines of Hill Day, which is where large tech groups, for example IEEE, get people from different technology areas to Washington with a whole lot of meetings lined up. We're a very small organization and can't manage that, but MODA's kicked off International Humanoids Day, and that is another great way to get the discussions in the ears of people that matter, because I still see a huge difference. We have legislators talking about autonomous vehicles and AI, but those are the technological areas where there are giant companies with large stacks of money and lots of lobbyists. Hands up how many robotics companies have big, big wallets and lots of lobbyists, aside from possibly Intuitive Surgical. Yeah, we're an emerging industry, and this is perhaps one of the biggest problems. How do we get our voice heard in places that it counts? And I was going to say, great idea, MODA, International Humanoids Day, because people love seeing what is happening in robots. They also love saying robots are going to steal our jobs. And that's one of the other taboo topics we wanted to mention. But I'll get to that after we talk a little bit about, could it be a good way to go about this? Having a day of robots and getting politicians engaged.
And one of the things we wanted to do with the event is to kind of have a great cocktail of interesting topics, one of which was covered earlier in a panel by Aaron Crother, who is the head of the standards for humanoid robotics. How do you think these standards can actually facilitate the job for, say, Governor Newsom's, or even regulations potentially that could be going into Washington? And why aren't so many organizations vocal about this?
To some extent, I think the culture in Silicon Valley is that we are focused on innovation, and looking at the energy that we see in the demonstrations, it's sort of like at that very geeky level. And there is a saying that we may not want politics, but politics may want us. So as the CEOs and the founders, they have to be a little cognizant that some of these regulations that may come our way would actually, be the end of business for us, perhaps. So it's important that we have to engage and engage in political discussions, whether it's with the governor or whether it's with the local congressman, but essentially provide that influence where they are able to be a messenger out there in Washington. It doesn't mean that we have to hire lobbyists, but just ensuring that dialogue would be very, very helpful.
So Senator Britt explicitly wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, I think, or Washington Post, one of the two, saying, whistling basically, or blowing a whistle on Chinese humanoids being used for or as weapons. What's your take on that?
So I think that's a fact, and I'm glad somebody is calling it out. Now, we in America need to do a few things. In California, we actually did the computer science curriculum, which I was very proud to be part of. So every K-12 public school child is studying computer science. Now we need to redo the curriculum for artificial intelligence and for robotics. And we need to have public-private sector partnerships, and we need to ensure that there is a single body in Washington that is responsible for AI and robotics. And this is how we can beat China in their game. That's critical. I think he's addressed the problem, and we need to find solutions now.
We are actually looking for a balanced political representation to get the National Robotics Caucus back up. I've been involved with that with IEEE Robotics and Automation. So we should definitely talk about that. But I'm going to be a contrarian here. I think that calling out humanoids and weaponization of Chinese humanoid robots as an existential threat, I believe that was called, to America, honestly, you're over-engineering, you're overthinking it. we have perfectly good autonomous weapons without them needing to be humanoids. And I find the same thing with one of the other taboo topics, sex robots. They don't really have to be fully humanoid to be capable of being a handy sex object. And if you look at the accident and emergency statistics of any hospital, there are entire journals devoted to sex-related mishaps involving various objects. It doesn't have to be a humanoid. Any vacuum cleaner will do.
I think we have about 4 minutes left. One last question from me, and then I want to take a few questions from the audience. Risha, I know you ran for Congress twice, and I know you have a strong opinion about who is the next governor of California. Tell us about the current work that's being done as a group for AI in Sacramento, whatever you can tell us about it, because I know there's a lot that's been happening behind the scenes. We talked about it in private, behind private doors, but tell us a little bit more about what should people expect coming out of Sacramento in the near term when it comes to AI, embodied AI, because AI is, or robotics, which is the manifestation of physical AI.
Well, you may have heard of the deep fake bill that was signed by Governor Gavin Newsom. So to some extent, I think it's piecemeal approach when it comes to legislation of AI, and robotics has not been thought of much yet. So AI is the big evil that they are trying to address. And to some extent, I believe Silicon Valley has not quite engaged with Sacramento. And that's the reason why we see all these piecemeal bills that are coming that are going to be harmful for the industry. And Senate Bill 1047 is a prime example. So, an inventor of a pen, if somebody used the pen instead of writing, if they used it to poke somebody in the eye, then the inventor of the pen or the manufacturer of the pen would be liable for it, So that was Senate Bill 1047. So if you leave it to the legislators, it won't be done right. What I noticed though with the Trump administration is we have an AI czar, somebody who's in charge. And in my book, I talk about actually creating an organization focused for this particular purpose. And so if that happens, I think we'll have an approach which is a lot more pragmatic, but also process-driven to ensure that we are making the right choices. Now, going back to the candidates who are running, I think we need to understand what their policy is on AI and robotics. And many a times, if you look at the last presidential race with Vice President Kamala Harris, she had a 90-day runway, and we didn't have the chance to analyze what her policy positions were. And given the fact that the election for the governor is in 2026, it's giving us an opportunity to invite them, and it's very easy because they would like to engage with us. So invite Betty Yee or Tony Atkins or Eleni and invite them into your backyard, have discussions with them, and try to understand where they stand on policies. That could be very powerful because it's important for us to educate them a little bit too. And we don't see that happening because we are so focused on innovation, we in Silicon Valley. And I think we need to change that.
Thank you very much. We can line up questions, and there is a microphone coming over. Comes over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Milton Walker, formerly of Intel Corporation. You guys each touched on some really interesting and common concepts in this panel and the previous panel with Aaron Prather. And a lot of it was about finding alignment and engagement, right? And around culture and driving some of the engagement from the larger community of people to help drive some of these outcomes, right? How do you both kind of create the culture of driving that engagement from a top-down perspective and a bottom-up perspective? How do you change that engagement so we can get those things passed and get those conversations happening?
So, when you look at the innovation that is happening here, we we haven't really approached it from bottoms up or top down. We just sort of like wait for something to happen. You look at social media and the firestorm it created with that hearing. Mark Zuckerberg had to get up and apologize to families who are sitting behind, who were impacted with the woes of Instagram and Facebook or whatever else, right? So to some extent, this has not been part of a culture, and that's the reason why we in Silicon Valley, and it can be driven from the venture capital investors, but we need to write a playbook of how do we apply our conscience to how we develop technology and solutions. It's absolutely lacking today. And that's when the hammer of Uncle Sam comes and falls upon us, and then we have to correct course, but that's not the way we should behave, you know. So to some extent, we have to drive it bottoms up and engage with the policymakers. That would make a huge difference. Good question.
Just a quick comment here. I think it's always striking a right balance between moving fast and breaking things in innovation and adhering to certain rules and guidelines, because we live in a civilized society. And so it's always going to be a push and pull, but engaging those conversations is really important. Sacramento is an hour away, like you mentioned, from here, yet there is so much distance, virtually, in terms of theories and agreements. And I think there is no other way to bridge that gap than to engage in meaningful conversations, being proactive, and just sitting on a round table and hammering the issues together.
I would love to see more actual feedback and studies around the role of robotics and labor, because ultimately political decisions are driven by grassroots opinions. And if the primary opinion that people have about robots is, 1, they're sexy, 2, they're dangerous, and 3, they're going to steal my job, then that's what we need to combat. And it's very, very hard to come back and say, well, your job might change, but it's not actually going to steal your job. And we know that robots increase productivity and they increase the viability of companies. And I usually say, you shouldn't get worried if your company is talking about robots, because it's going to grow, it's going to be profitable, it's going to expand, you're going to get better jobs. You should be worried if your company is not getting robots, because it's going to go bankrupt in the next year.
It's the way of the future, and if you remember just like last year, we were talking about pausing AI, but if we pause AI, the rest of the world is going to move fast and furious forward, and we will fall behind by like a decade very quickly, because these things take time. So the imperative is for us to embrace these things and educate our politicians that this is absolutely the right approach. We cannot fall behind. And that's the only way we can ensure that we beat China at the game.
Absolutely. With that, I want to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Rishi, for joining us. Thank you, Andra. I know Matt Ondler, president of Axiom Space, apologizes and he couldn't be here. So because we are just a little bit over time, we're going to continue the rest of the afternoon and probably be back on track by then.
Yeah, and that means I believe it is lunchtime.
It is lunchtime.
It is lunchtime, everybody. Be back on time